Hey, what's up? I've been getting more interested in DevourFont lately, and a few people have asked me how I set it up for use in-game, so I figured it'd be worth making a short guide for it. Everything I'm showing here is based on my own testing. I'm not claiming these are objectively the best settings possible, but they're the best results I've found myself and are what I would personally recommend. So if you find something that works better, then definitely let me know in the comments or on Discord. I wanted to mention first that some of my recommended settings have changed pretty significantly since DevourFont was originally released. I've updated the README that's included with the download, but if you're using an older setup from that README, then I'd recommend comparing your settings with the ones I'm showing here, especially with the config files and the VirtualMIDISynth settings. I'll assume you've already downloaded DevourFont, and I have the download linked in the description as usual. I'm going to cover two different ways of using the font. First with Fluidsynth, which is built directly into most source ports, and then VirtualMIDISynth, which is an external Windows MIDI synthesizer. I'll cover how to use both of these methods with both DSDA-Doom and with the latest UZDoom, since they're what I use personally, although I think the setup for other ports would be fairly similar if they support either Fluidsynth or external MIDI outputs. I'd recommend Fluidsynth as the easiest option for someone who just wants to install DevourFont and use it in-game, but VirtualMIDISynth is still my go-to. I find it extremely useful, since it's what I use for all of my MIDI to WAV conversions. I think the output quality is extremely high with those, and also its standard live play is very good as long as the settings are set properly, but there are advantages to both methods. Fluidsynth is already built into both DSDA and UZDoom and basically all other ports as far as I know, so there's not really anything additional you need to install to get it to work. You really just have to include the SoundFont file in the correct place in the file structure and point the source port to it in the config file. For UZDoom and other ZDoom ports, as far as I know, you really just have to drop it into the SoundFont folder. And then, if you don't know how to find the config file for UZDoom, it's stored separately, but if you go into in-game options, then there's this browse game config button, and that'll pull it up, and you have the ini file here. So, if we open that up, then scroll down a bit to the, where is it? The fluid settings here, and here's where you'd set it up. So go into here. These are the settings that I've tested and come to. For a long time, I really didn't like how my font and really any other font sounded through Fluidsynth. It tended to sound a lot heavier and more washed out than intended, especially comparing to how it sounded in VirtualMIDISynth. But after doing some more testing, I found that a lot of the difference was just coming through the Fluidsynth effect settings rather than the SoundFont itself, especially because in the in-game settings, it's really not as in-depth as it is in the config file. So if you go to MIDI player in Fluidsynth, you can turn reverb and chorus on and then set the gain, the MIDI voices, but that's all you really get in here. If you go into the config file, then you get everything. You can set the depth and, speed, damping, room size, width, everything. So you get a lot more control in here, and this is where I found that a lot of the old default settings actually really blew out the reverb and chorus and made them a lot more pronounced than they should have been, and it really became overwhelming and made it sound a lot different than I intended it to. So these are the settings that I've come to. Obviously, this is something, it's a personal preference, and you can mess with them all you want, but I've found that these are good medium values for everything. It works basically the same for DSDA. You just have to drop the SoundFont file directly into the folder, like the main folder for DSDA, where the source port file is. It doesn't need to be in like the autoload folder or anything like that. It just needs to be there so that you can reference it. And then set these things in the config. I wouldn't recommend doing this in the actual game menu. Again, it doesn't have all of the settings. First, you just set the sound player to Fluidsynth, and then specify the sound font to the file name. It doesn't need the full path, just because it's in the folder, it's going to be able to recognize it. And then you'll notice that the values are scaled differently, but these are pretty much the equivalent to what I set it for UZDoom, just scaled up. And they're not all the exact same settings, but it's the closest I've found to recreating it. Now, the reason I use Fluidsynth for DSDA over VirtualMIDISynth is because of the vid dump that I use. So I'd be happy to talk about vid dump a different time, which is basically an easy way to convert a demo file into a video, right? It just plays it back, and then you have the video file. However, in my experience, it's not really compatible with port MIDI, since the VirtualMIDISynth is then handling the audio externally, so it just doesn't render into the video. But if you set it to Fluidsynth and then load the SoundFont, then it will render properly. It's a little bit of a trade-off, since it does technically sound different than it would in VirtualMIDISynth and thus the album uploads that I usually make, but it sounds close enough that it's good for the videos. If anyone does know of a way to use a port MIDI or an external synthesizer with vid dump, then please let me know. The other option I'll cover is VirtualMIDISynth by Coolsoft, which has been my method of playback since the very start of development of the font. It's what I've always used, it's always been consistent, and it's what I would personally recommend. Its main benefit is its conversion tool for converting the MIDIs into WAV files, which is what I've always used for the albums. You can see here, I have it up, that you drop MIDI files in and convert it to whatever format you want. I use these 30-bit floats, and then I drop them into Audacity, where I run a normalization macro that I made. But I've found that the quality of these outputs with consistency and just rendering all the effects correctly with the reverb and chorus, it's pretty much unmatched. However, the live rendering is also very good. You just need to set up the options correctly, since otherwise it may have some situations where if there's multiple of the same instrument playing identical notes on top of each other, then it will start to get kind of muddy, or like they're fighting over each other. It just doesn't sound good. But I've found setting some of the options to, in a certain way will mitigate that, and it will also never show up in the renderings, since it's not trying to render them in real time, so it wouldn't experience those issues. One of the major benefits of VirtualMIDISynth is also, since it is an external rendering process, then you can know that the output is going to be identical wherever you configure it to be used. So if you're using it in DSDA, or if you're using it in UZDoom, or if you're using it in some MIDI editing software like Sakaiju, where you can select an external rendering tool, then you know that the output is going to be identical because it's handled in the same way. Anyways, to get started, easy, just drop the file directly into there and hit apply, and now it will be ready to be used. You can drop a whole bunch of fonts in here at once and then easily switch between them, which I also did a lot during development. I would recommend having this preload the SoundFont to memory to improve play smoothness. Definitely have that checked off if your computer can comfortably run it with that much RAM. I mean, it is almost a gigabyte of a file, so preloading that much to memory does use a decent amount, but if your computer can comfortably run DevourFont in the first place, then it's probably fine to leave this enabled. One of the other, there's a plugin for a MIDI mapper, which isn't really necessary for this, but I like to use it just in case, but this allows you to set VirtualMIDISynth as the actual default MIDI mapping option, like in your machine. So that would probably make it more compatible with, whatever other apps you may want to use it with. Anything that doesn't have a selection built in for other MIDI rendering tools. Anyways, going through the options now. These are the settings that I would recommend. You may toy with them and find something better, but from my testing, this is the best I've found that mitigates those issues with overlapping instruments and anything like that. So 250 is pre-standard output buffer. 44-100 is definitely the sample rate that's standard for all over. That's what it was designed for. And anywhere else that you have an option for sample rate, I would put it at 44-100. 10,000 is like totally excessive for polyphony. however you pronounce that, but yeah, this is basically just saying, like, there's an technically infinite limit of notes that could play at once. Like, you'd never get anywhere close to 10,000. You just put it at some arbitrarily high number, like 4,000 would be fine. It doesn't matter. They released the oldest instance of a note upon a note off event. I had that unchecked for the longest time, but I found that I think that's actually what fixes the issue with those overlapping notes sounding weird, so I would keep that one checked. I thought maybe that it would, like, decrease the, you know, depth or complexity of certain tracks, but no, it doesn't do that. It's different than what I thought it was, so yeah, check that off. I'm not sure why sync interpolated sample mixing was off, but turn that on. That is one of the more important ones to have on. It warns about CPU usage, but I don't think it's really an issue. For the max rendering time percentage, I set it to 0 because that just means there's effectively no limit. It's rare that you'll see that much difference with it, but that's what I would recommend. And then I would keep both of these off. I haven't seen that much difference with them, but any difference I have seen has been negative. For the reverb and chorus max level, I set them to 64 just as like a you know, a middling limit, so that it's not affecting the quality at all, or like preventing it from fully rendering the effects. But yeah, that's standard limit. And then definitely do not check the override received MIDI sysx messages, since these are the reverb and chorus settings that are like part of the notes themselves in the MIDI file, so do not have that checked off. And then leave the master reverb level to 1. So for UZDoom and other ZDoom ports, it is very easy to set up VirtualMIDISynth, since in-game it recognizes both VirtualMIDISynth and actually the CoolSoft MIDI mapper. If you have that downloaded, it will just automatically show up under MIDI devices, and you can select either of those since it'll just point to the, you know, same thing and have the same output, but in here, the horrible OPL synth emulation. And actually, if you have the MIDI mapper set up, then it'll even be used for some of the other the settings that are already in here. It won't sound exactly the same. It'll sound closer to Fluidsynth, but I mean, there's other options here that you could toy around with if you wanted to. Like Timidity now automatically will point to DevourFont through the MIDI mapper, I believe. And here it is, the MIDI mapper being sent to VirtualMIDISynth, so this is how I would recommend using it. That's the old shitty one, and then this is, once again, the VirtualMIDISynth output. So if you just have VirtualMIDISynth installed and not the MIDI mapper, then this will be the one that will show up, just VirtualMIDISynth number 1. So you go to the MIDI mapper and set the default MIDI device to VirtualMIDISynth number 1. This one always gets reset to the wavetable, but you can also set that if you're using Windows Media Player for whatever reason. I don't think you need to do any other setup besides downloading VirtualMIDISynth and adding the SoundFont to it for it to like actually show up in UZDoom as a selection, though. Like I mentioned before, the nice thing about VirtualMIDISynth is that you set all of those parameters once in the actual app, and then you don't have to mess around with it anymore, whether you're using it in GZDoom or DSDA, so there's no reason to go into the config. Otherwise, you know, if you're using VirtualMIDISynth, it's just as easy as selecting it in the in the game. For DSDA, it's about the same, except you're going to see it as port MIDI instead, which, if you don't see it in-game, then you can just go to the config file and set it right here. Just type in port MIDI and save it, and it'll be fine, but I'll show in-game real quick. Just open, I use the DSDA launcher, but right now it's using Fluidsynth with all of the parameters I've had before. You'll see that's Fluidsynth, or and then select port MIDI, and it sounds slightly quieter, but it's basically the same output. May sound slightly different depending on the MIDI, but that is what I'd recommend for playback if you don't care about vid dumping. So once again, if you just want to download DevourFont and start using it in Doom, and this goes for really any font. You could any custom font if you wanted to use them in game. Really, this doesn't have to be specific to DevourFont. It's just those two methods are the best I've found for handling such a dense font. But anyways, I would start with Fluidsynth if all you really care about is playing with it, and you don't care about it being like the absolute perfect output. I think the VirtualMIDISynth output is slightly better, and it also allows you to have slightly more control over things. But it does require having, you know, another program running in the background. If you want a consistent external MIDI renderer, though, then you definitely want VirtualMIDISynth. I personally use both, since the DSDA limitation with the vid dumps, then I use Fluidsynth there and VirtualMIDISynth everywhere else. If you need any other help with setup or anything else, just have questions, then again, let me know over Discord or in the comments. I'd be happy to help. And also let me know if you'd like other videos like this going over MIDI concepts. It's just kind of my first time speaking in a video intentionally, so, you know, I'm not sure if my sound is, or my voice is super clear here. Let me know. I'll get better at speaking, I'm sure. I'd like to do a video going over my big WAD tracker at some time, so let me know if you'd be interested in that. It contains a whole lot of different tools for managing speed runs and other things.